heads of delegations, ministers, members of delegations attending this summit, and distinguished guests. It is an honor and pleasure to participate in this August meeting, especially as we meet in this beautiful country in Belén, Costa Rica. Mr. Chairman, I join those who have spoken before me to recognize the warm hospitality of the Costa Rican people. I want to thank you for the excellent organization of this summit, for the tremendous work we have done over the past year with Costa Rica's leadership as pro tempore president, a task which could not be possible unless you had yourself an excellent group of dedicated professionals. I recognize especially my friend Foreign Minister Manuel Gonzalez Sanz and his entire team. The theme for this meeting, Building Together, is timely and necessary as we discuss our efforts to eradicate poverty with an emphasis on transparency, accountability, and the fight against corruption. I take it that implicit in this theme is the recognition and acknowledgement that today, perhaps for the first time in the history of our hemisphere, we possess all the elements necessary for the eradication of poverty, and that perhaps our greatest impediments for attaining this objective is the absence of transparency, accountability, and equity and justice in the stewardship of the resources of our hemisphere and the ubiquitous scourge of corruption. I can think of no better forum for debating this theme than this, the third summit of CELAC. It is sobering, Mr. President, to contemplate the paradox and the injustice in the manner in which benefits and costs of growth or regression are distributed in this interdependent world. We now know, for example, that even in the years of global financial and economic downturn, the richest 1% in the world became richer, and the share of global wealth held by the less fortunate actually decreased. And where there has been economic growth, the gap between the haves and the have-nots has expanded. The rich indeed has gotten richer, and the poor poorer, as foretold in the Bible. It certainly cannot be right that 80% of the world's population owns only 5% of the world's assets. And it is certainly scandalous that the 80 richest people in the world own as much wealth as the poorest 3.5 billion, and that the wealth of those richest 80 persons actually doubled in cash terms between 2009 and 2014. Mr. President, Oxfam's latest findings show that the richest 1% have seen their share of global wealth increase from 44% in 2009 to 48% in 2014, and at this rate will be more than 50% in 2016. Given such global inequities, one cannot help conclude that there is a fundamental injustice underlying our global reality, an injustice which cries out for correction. And as leaders, we are called upon to respond to that cry. We have seen figures which show that successes have been achieved around the world over the last decade as part of our efforts to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. We have in Latin America and the Caribbean improved our indicators in education, health, poverty, unemployment, and in other areas that address conditions of vulnerability. There remain, however, serious underlying problems of inequity as exposure to risks and vulnerabilities appear to deepen and increase for the world's poor. Growth drives our economies, but its value becomes questionable when it is not inclusive, and when the majority of our populations feel they do not have a stake in it. Social cohesion is always harmed when our citizens feel excluded from society. In this globalized and interdependent world, we witness each day how the events in one country are interwoven and interlinked with the rest of the world. One therefore wonders why there is so much resistance to the completion of a solid and binding, balanced agreement on climate change, a phenomenon that is the product of unrestrained industrialization and whose greenhouse gas emissions affect developing countries the most, particularly small island developing states and low-lying coastal states, countries that have no responsibility for changes of the Earth's atmosphere. But these effects do not only affect the small countries and the low-lying coastal countries, but they affect every single country in the world. Those who have a historic responsibility to address the problems associated with climate change do not seem to share the same urgency which we in developing countries place in tackling what is a fundamental threat to humanity and which threatens the very existence of small island states and low-lying states. They can enjoy such luxury for the time being because even though they are also affected by climate change, they are not suffering the extent of the damages that we are presently suffering and will continue to suffer unless concerted global actions are taken. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us that the evidence leaves no room for doubt that the impacts of changing weather conditions and global warming will be even greater in the future. Conservative estimates of a 2.5-degree rise in temperature project that it will cost Latin American and Caribbean economies up to 5% of GDP. The United Nations has found that these growing threats affect poor people the most, that 98% of those killed or affected by natural disasters are from developing countries. Mr. President, up to 50% of the world's population already live on less than $2.50 per day. Even if development practitioners extol the fact that a large share of the world's population has escaped the trap of poverty, we also know that those who are in the new middle class can just as easily fall back into the trap. Any sudden change of circumstances can reverse their progress, and such risks are exacerbated by changing weather patterns and the effects of climate change. Without adequate social safety nets, their new conditions remain precarious at the very least. It is startling, therefore, to note the ILO figures showing that only 28% of the world's population enjoy the benefits of comprehensive social protection. We in our hemisphere can congratulate ourselves that governments are taking a lead and have been working assiduously on expanding the safety nets and empowering our people through programs of better education, health, infrastructure, and jobs, and in consolidating our democracies and improving the overall welfare of our citizens. But whereas we have achieved growth, the distribution of the benefits of that growth has been uneven. Latin America and the Caribbean today has the unenviable distinction of being one of the regions with the highest levels of inequity in the world. Discrimination based on gender, racism, and class distinction remain deeply rooted problems in select societies. We have at the same time been suffering epidemic levels of crime and violence. The murder rate increased by 11% over the last 10 years in Latin America and the Caribbean. And every day, some 460 people suffer the consequences of sexual violence. As much as 33 million of our people still go hungry every day, and 77 million of our people are indigent. History tells us that no society can achieve stability and cohesion if the fruits of prosperity are not shared in an inclusive way, so that the majority of its population will have an interest in defending and preserving its unity. The job of governments is to ensure that our citizens enjoy rising living standards, and that the majority can benefit from the opportunities of social mobility. On the other hand, failure to do so will produce conditions that are ripe for broken communities, disintegrated societies, and unstable political systems. Our citizens must feel confident that hard work and discipline will be rewarded and that their children will have better opportunities than they ever had. They need to have opportunities to work and gain economic security through higher incomes and benefit from social safety nets that reduce human insecurity and vulnerabilities. We live in a world where technology and open markets define our interdependent world. Today's economy puts a premium on knowledge and higher learning, high-level skills and qualifications without which our individual chances of advancement are restricted. Trends suggest ominously that unskilled labor will continue being squeezed out in today's economies. But our region is populated in large measure by unskilled laborers. We would therefore do well to take heed of UNDP surveys of Latin American prisons, which found that up to 60 to 85% of the prison population were working before they ended up in jail. This speaks to the quality of employment, not to whether they have any employment. It tells us that a positive employment rate does not necessarily mean that poverty and vulnerability have been overcome. Low-quality jobs and poor incomes, like no job and no income, invariably leads people to supplant their incomes through illegal means. The only proven sustainable response through the ages has been to invest in the most valuable natural resource any country could ever have, and that is its people. We must place special emphasis on the empowerment of all our citizens, but most especially on the empowerment of our women folk who birth and nurture our children and imbue them with the moral and ethical values necessary for them to become responsible citizens of our societies. We must also place emphasis on education and skill development, on entrepreneurship, business creation, and quality jobs. You must expand the reach of early childhood education, increase the quality of our schools, eliminate financial barriers to higher education, and support apprenticeship programs to drive higher skill levels. Technical and vocational training centers must be made centers of excellence, just like our colleges and universities. We have to work towards creating stronger, fairer, and more sustainable and dynamic societies and economies. We need to reconfigure our institutions to become more responsive to the needs of our citizens. This requires modernization, not just of our systems and bureaucratic processes, but also of our antiquated laws and regulations. We need to strengthen all our public, private, and civil society institutions that help us to foment cohesive, stable, and secure communities. We are blessed in this region with rich and diverse natural resources. It has always been within the capacities of our citizens to extract fabulous riches from nature's bounty. These riches must henceforth be distributed more equitably among our citizens. It cannot be doubted that we now have in our region the leadership necessary to transform our economies and societies, to generate wealth, to eradicate poverty and hunger, and hence enhance the standard of living of all our citizens. The experience of our friendly country, Cuba, over the last 60 years has shown us that the self-determination of people who live in solidarity can overcome all kinds of challenges. Cubans have shown us that by investing in its citizens, all its citizens, their society is empowered and their nation is stronger. The struggle of the Cuban people is our struggle, and that struggle keeps inspiring people and nations across the world. I therefore take this opportunity to join the rest of the world in congratulating Cuba and the Obama administration for the recent developments and their decision to reestablish diplomatic relations. We also thank Pope Francis, the Argentine, for his involvement and invaluable contribution behind the scenes to these developments. We also welcome President Obama's acknowledgement that it is past time to lift the embargo, and we encourage him to make liberal use of his executive powers to alleviate the hardships and suffering of the Cuban people being caused by the embargo. Along the same lines, we call for the lifting of all forms of unilateral and unjust measures against the sovereign and independent nations in our hemisphere. There are success stories and good practices in each of our countries and across our hemisphere. In this community of Latin America and the Caribbean, we can do more to benefit from each other's experiences, to encourage and support each other, to promote more South-South cooperation, and together face the global challenges that confront us all. Our region possesses abundant low-hanging fruits that we can all harvest very easily and which can conduce greatly to our eradication of poverty. The establishment of this community marked a signal commitment among ourselves. It was a notice to the world that we would henceforth strive to extract strength and solidarity from our diversity, that we will no longer be distant neighbors, that we are committed to solving our own problems, and that we will in solidarity work together in the zone of peace and free of nuclear weapons to overcome our common challenges. After 200 years of searching, we are now convinced that the solution to our problems reside right here in our hemisphere. Mr. President, we in Belize are convinced that this forum of political dialogue and coordinated action has already been bearing dividends for all of us. As much as history divided us in the past, we are convinced that the future through CELAC will unite us under the fundamental principles which mark the founding of this community. In addition to what we do together multilaterally, we are also witnessing our growing together bilaterally. Since the last summit in Havana, we have had the pleasure in Belize to receive high-level visits of several delegations from countries of South America, which a few years ago would not ordinarily form part of our bilateral engagements. We were happy to welcome, for example, high-level delegation from Ecuador, the incoming pro tempore presidency, from Argentina, Uruguay, Venezuela, Chile, among others. At the same time, Belize is in the process of opening an embassy in Venezuela. There is much more we can do to get to know each other better. I am convinced that our relationship should not be based only on meetings such as these. Instead, we must promote more exchanges between our countries at all levels of people, of businesses, and civil society. The more we learn about each other, the more we appreciate that we are indeed our brothers' keepers. We are also convinced that it is only useful, it is indeed necessary for us to keep an open conversation, to find consensus around the priority targets for the development, and in concerted action address our common challenges. Latin America and the Caribbean must become a zone of prosperity. We must eradicate poverty, and together we have no doubt we can achieve that goal. I thank you, Mr. President.